There is a proposal on the table that would change how your cost of living adjustment is calculated, and the shorthand version going around is that it would cut benefits for 80% of retirees. That number is not made up, and it is not a scare figure either. It comes directly out of how the proposal is built. But almost nobody explains why it is 80%, and until you know that, you cannot tell whether you are in the 80 or the 20. So today we are going to take apart the 3 different proposals for changing the adjustment formula. One of them would pay you more, 2 of them would pay you less, and one of them changes something the other 2 do not touch at all, which is who gets what. I am Ray, and this is Social Security Decoded. Let me set the baseline in one paragraph, because we did the current formula in detail a week ago, and I do not want to repeat myself. Right now, your adjustment is tied to an index called the CPI-E wage earners and clerical workers. The third quarter of this year gets compared with the third quarter of last year. The percentage change becomes your adjustment, and it is announced in October. That is the machine as it stands, and everything we discuss today is a proposal to change one piece of it. Now, Proposal 1, and this is the only one of the 3 that would put more money in your check. It is the CPI-E. The E stands for elderly, and it is an index the Bureau of Labor Statistics already produces. It is not hypothetical. It measures the same goods and services, priced in the same places, and the only thing that differs is the weighting. Instead of weighting the basket by what wage earners buy, it weights it by what people over 62 buy. The biggest single difference is healthcare. In the elderly index, healthcare carries a weight of roughly 11%. In the wage earner index, the one that currently sets your check, it carries about 5.6%. That gap exists because it should. People 65 and older spend more than twice as much on healthcare as younger consumers do, and people 75 and older spend nearly 3 times as much. So the elderly index is describing your basket more accurately than the one being used. Now, how much would it actually be worth? This is where I want to manage your expectations, because the honest answer is smaller than the argument around it suggests. Averaged across the years since 1984, the elderly index has run about 0.2 of a percentage point per year above the wage earner index. 0.2. On a $2,000 benefit in a single year, that is around $4 a month. So, if somebody tells you that switching to the elderly index would transform your retirement, they are overselling it. What it would do is stop a small leak that runs in one direction every year for as long as you live. Over 20 or 30 years of retirement, a compounding 0.2 is genuinely worth having. In any one year, you would barely notice. And notice something about the politics of it, which explains why it has been discussed for decades without happening. It costs money. It does not save any. Every other proposal on this list exists partly because Social Security has a long-term funding gap, and this one makes that gap slightly wider. Proposal 2. The chained CPI. This is the one that has been proposed most often, by both parties at different times, and it is the hardest of the 3 to explain honestly, so let me try. A regular price index asks what a fixed basket of goods cost this year compared with last year. A chained index asks a slightly different question. It allows for the fact that when the price of something rises, people buy less of it and more of something else. If beef gets expensive, some households buy more chicken. The chained index tries to account for that substitution. Whether that is a fair adjustment or a quiet cut depends entirely on what you think about the substitution. Economists who support it say it measures the real cost of maintaining the same standard of living. People who oppose it point out that if you are already substituting because you cannot afford the first thing, calling that stable is doing some work. I am not going to settle that argument here. What I can give you is the size. Social Security's actuaries put it at about 0.3 of a percentage point off the average adjustment every year. Now watch what 0.3 does over time, because this is the whole story of the chained index. In a single year, it is nothing. On a $2,000 check, it is about $6 a month, which nobody would notice. But the reduction compounds, because each year's smaller adjustment becomes the base for the next year's. Over a 12-year period, one analysis found the current index would have raised benefits by 34%, while the chained index would have raised them by 29%. That is 5% less, and it is 5% less on every payment for the rest of your life. Run it out to 30 years, and the estimated reduction for a low-income household is around 6%. And this is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the reason the chained index is politically attractive and personally awkward. The people it costs the most are the people who live the longest. A cut that compounds is a cut aimed, without meaning to be, at the very old. And the very old are also, statistically, more likely to be women, and more likely to have exhausted whatever other savings they had. On the other side of the ledger, the chained index would eliminate somewhere in the range of 14 to 18% of the program's long-term shortfall, depending on whose estimate you use. So it is a real contribution to solvency. It is just paid for entirely by people already receiving benefits. Before we go to the third one, I want to give you the substitution argument properly, because it is the whole case for the chained index, and I do not think it is fair to wave at it. Here's the example the economists use. Suppose beef gets expensive this month. A household that was buying beef every week buys it every other week and buys chicken in between. Their grocery bill goes up less than the price of beef went up because they changed what was in the basket. A fixed basket index does not see that. It prices the old basket and reports the full increase. A chained index sees it and reports the smaller one. And the argument is that the smaller one is closer to what the household actually experienced. Now here is the objection, and I want you to have both halves. That argument treats every substitution as equivalent. But there is a difference between switching from beef to chicken because you prefer chicken this week, and switching because beef has moved out of reach. The index cannot tell those apart. It records both as a household maintaining its standard of living at lower cost. And the objection lands harder, the tighter the budget is. A household with room in it substitutes by choice, and for them the chained index is probably measuring something real. A household with no room substitutes because it must, and for them, the same measurement is recording a reduction in living standards as though it were stability. That is the argument, both sides of it, in as few words as I can manage. Where you land on it probably depends on which of those two households you have been. Proposal 3. The flat rate adjustment. And this is the interesting one because it does something the other two do not. The first two proposals change the percentage. Everybody still gets a percentage. It is just a different percentage. The flat rate proposal stops using a percentage at all. Here is the mechanism. You take the adjustment percentage, whatever it works out to be. You apply it to one specific benefit amount, the benefit received by somebody at the 20th percentile of all beneficiaries. That produces a dollar figure, and then every single beneficiary receives that same dollar figure, regardless of the size of their own benefit. Now you can see where the 80% comes from, and it is arithmetic rather than rhetoric. If the raise is calculated on the benefit at the 20th percentile, then everyone above the 20th percentile receives less than they would have. That is 80% of beneficiaries, by definition. It is not an estimate of how many people would be harmed. It is what the design says. And notice who it favors. The 20% below that line get more than a percentage would have given them. So it is a redistribution inside the program, from higher benefits to lower ones, dressed up as a change to the adjustment. Whether you think that is right or wrong depends on what you think Social Security is for. If you see it as insurance against poverty and old age, this is a reasonable direction. If you see it as an earned benefit proportional to what you paid in, this breaks that link, permanently and by a little more every year. Let me give you the size of it, because AARP ran a case that makes it concrete. Take somebody who started collecting an average benefit in 1998. Under the current system, by age 93, their annual benefit reaches about $22,600. Under a flat rate adjustment applied since 1998, that same person's benefit in 2026 would be about $18,000. That is a gap of $4,600 a year, which is 20%. And the cumulative loss across the whole retirement, in inflation-adjusted dollars, comes to more than $77,000. $77,000 from a change that in its first year would have been almost invisible. And for completeness, the solvency side. Urban Institute modeling suggests that if a flat rate adjustment based on the 20th percentile were enacted in 2027, it would close about half of Social Security's 75-year funding shortfall. Half. That is a very large number, and it is why this proposal is being taken seriously despite what it does to 80% of recipients. There is no other single change to the adjustment formula that comes close to that. Now, let me give you the part you can actually run on your own check. 3 benefit levels and 1 adjustment year, so you can see all 3 proposals side by side. Say the adjustment works out at 3.5%, roughly where the forecasts are sitting. Under the current formula, somebody with a $1,500 benefit gets $52.50. Somebody at $2,500 gets $87.50. Somebody at $3,500 gets $122.50. Under the elderly index, add roughly 0.2 of a point. So those become about $55.50, $92.50, and about $129.50. Everybody gains a little, and the people with larger benefits gain slightly more in dollars because it is still a percentage. Under the chained index, subtract about 0.3. Those become roughly 48, 80, and 112. Everybody loses a little, and again the loss is proportional. Under the flat rate, all 3 people receive the same dollar amount. If the 20th percentile benefit is somewhere around $1,300, then 3.5% of that is about $45.50, and that is what all 3 receive. Look at what that does. The person at $1,500 loses $7 a month compared with today. The person at $2,500 loses $42. The person at $3,500 loses $77. Same proposal. 3 completely different experiences of it. That is what makes this one different from the other 2. And it is why the flat rate is the only one of the 3 where the first question is not how much, but where do I sit? Now there is one group these proposals hit differently, and almost no coverage mentions them, so I want to. The group I mean is survivors. Think about what happens to a household when one of 2 people dies. The household keeps the larger of the 2 benefits, and the smaller one stops. That is the rule, and we covered it properly a few weeks ago. So a surviving spouse is living on 1 benefit rather than 2, usually for a long time, and usually as a woman because women in that generation tend to outlive their husbands by several years. Now apply the compounding cut. A reduction of 0.3 of a point a year does almost nothing in year 1, but a survivor might be receiving benefits for 25 or 30 years in total. The cut compounds across every one of those years, and the person absorbing the largest cumulative version of it is precisely the person with the least ability to absorb it. That is not an argument against the chained index by itself. Reasonable people support it. But if you are going to weigh it on the person it lands on hardest, which is a widow in her late 80s living on 1 check, not on a couple in their 60s who will barely register the first few years. The flat rate proposal cuts the other way for that same person, and this is worth being fair about. If her benefit is below the 20th percentile, she gains under the flat rate. If it is above, she loses like everybody else above the line. So the 2 proposals are not simply better and worse. They land on different people. And that is the honest summary of this whole topic. There is no version of changing the formula where nobody is affected, because the formula is how the money is divided. Why is any of this being discussed at all? Because of the funding gap, and I want to be precise about that rather than dramatic. Social Security's trust funds are projected to run short in the early 2030s, and at that point, incoming payroll taxes would still cover the large majority of scheduled benefits, but not all of them. That is the pressure behind every proposal on this list. We did the arithmetic of that projection in its own episode, and I would rather point you there than compress it badly here. What matters for today is the connection. The adjustment formula is one of the few levers that affects every beneficiary at once, which makes it powerful for closing a gap, and which is exactly why it keeps coming back. Now, some housekeeping, and then I will let you go. First, none of this is law. These are proposals in the policy conversation. No adjustment formula has changed. This year's adjustment will be calculated the way it always has been, and it will be announced in October as usual. Nothing you have heard today changes a payment you are receiving. Second, be careful with the numbers I just gave you, in a specific way. The 3.5% I used is a placeholder for illustration, and the 20th percentile benefit figure moves every year. What is durable is not the dollars, it is the shape. 2 of these proposals change how much everybody gets, proportionally. 1 changes who gets what. Third, and this is the practical part. If you want to know where you would stand under the flat rate proposal, the question is simply whether your own benefit is above or below roughly the 20th percentile of all benefits. You do not need anybody to tell you your own number. It is on your benefit statement and in your online account, and it takes 2 minutes to look up. Knowing it means that when this is debated seriously, you will be reading about your own situation rather than about a category. And fourth, a word about how this gets covered. You are going to see headlines saying benefits will be cut for 80% of retirees, and headlines saying a plan would close half the funding gap. Both of those describe the same proposal. Neither is lying. They are just standing at different ends of it. So here is the short version of all three proposals. The elderly index would pay everybody slightly more, about 0.2 of a point a year, and it widens the funding gap rather than closing it. The chained index would pay everybody slightly less, about 0.3 of a point a year, compounding to something like 5% over 12 years and hitting the oldest hardest. And the flat rate adjustment would give every single beneficiary the same dollar raise, calculated on the 20th percentile benefit, which means 80% receive less than they do now, while closing about half of the long-term shortfall. Nothing has changed. But these are the 3 shapes the argument will take, and now you know which one you are hearing when you hear it. I am Ray. Take care of your record, and I will see you in the next one.